Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life. For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org. The following material is copyrighted and may not be duplicated, reproduced, or redistributed without prior written consent from the Veritas Forum. Join us as we explore true life.
Well, I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to be here at the University of Chicago to share on this topic as we look forward to Easter. And I've entitled my talk tonight, Contemporary Scholarship and the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus. Man, writes Lorne Isley, is the cosmic orphan. He's the only creature in the universe who asks why. Other animals have instincts to guide them. But man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Well, ever since the Enlightenment, when modern man threw off the shackles of religion, he's tried to answer those questions without reference to God. But the answers that came back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of matter plus time plus chance. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. Modern man thought that in divesting himself of God, he had freed himself from everything that stifled and oppressed him. Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had only succeeded in orphaning himself. And against this dark backdrop of the modern predicament, the traditional Christian hope of resurrection from the dead takes on an even greater brightness and significance. For it tells man that he is no orphan after all, but rather the personal creation of the Creator God of the universe. Nor is his life doomed to end in death. Rather, through the resurrection, he can live in the presence of God forever. Now, this is a wonderful hope. But of course, hope that is not founded upon fact is not hope at all, but mere delusion. Why should the Christian hope in resurrection from the dead strike us as anything more than just wishful thinking? Well, the answer lies in the Christian conviction that a man has been raised from the dead in advance by God, and his resurrection constitutes the harbinger and forerunner of our own resurrection, and constitutes the factual foundation upon which the Christian hope is predicated. And that man was, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. And it is upon his historical resurrection that the Christian hope is founded. Now, during the last century, liberal classical theology had no use for a literal, historical resurrection of Jesus. And this skepticism concerning the resurrection of Jesus was unalleviated by dialectical or existential theology. But a remarkable change came about during the second half of the 20th century. By 1968, the old skepticism was a spent force and then began very rapidly to recede. Indeed, so complete has been the turnabout during the second half of the 20th century concerning the resurrection of Jesus that I think that it is not an exaggeration to speak of a reversal of scholarship on this issue. Perhaps the most startling indication of this change would be the declaration by one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, Pinchas Lapid, who teaches at Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, that he is convinced, on the basis of the evidence, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. And Professor Lapid twits New Testament critics like Bultmann and Markson for their unjustified skepticism, and says that he concludes, on the basis of the evidence, that the God of Israel raised Jesus from the dead. Well, what are the facts that underlie this remarkable turnabout in New Testament studies concerning the credibility of the New Testament accounts of the resurrection of Jesus? It seems to me that they can be conveniently grouped under three broad headings. the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and the very origin of the Christian faith. And let's look briefly tonight at each one of these. First, the resurrection appearances. Undoubtedly, the major impetus for the reassessment of the appearance traditions in the New Testament was the demonstration by the German New Testament critic Joachim Jeremias that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 5, Paul is quoting from an old Christian tradition which he himself received and then in turn passed on to his converts. Paul writes the following: "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." And then comes this Christian tradition: that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, according to Paul's letter to the Galatian churches, chapter 1 and verse 18, Paul was in Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion on the Damascus Road on a fact-finding mission, during which time he conferred with both Peter and James over a 2-week period. And he probably received this oral tradition at that time, if not before. Now, when we recall that Jesus was crucified in AD 30, and that Paul was converted in AD 33, that means that this list of witnesses to the post-mortem appearances of Jesus goes back to within the first 5 years after Jesus' death. And thus it is idle to try to dismiss these appearances as legendary. John Dominic Crossan, who is an extremely skeptical New Testament critic who teaches at DePaul University here in the city, has estimated that it would take at least 5 to 10 years for Christians even to discover the Old Testament motifs that would be important for inventing the passion story of Jesus, the story of Jesus' suffering and death. And yet even the lower bound set by Professor Crossan, 5 years, is more than the boundary that is available for these appearance traditions about Jesus after his death. So that it is simply idle to try to dismiss these appearances as being legends. Now, we can try to explain them away as hallucinatory if we want to, but we cannot deny responsibly that they occurred. Paul's information makes it certain that on various occasions, different individuals and groups of people saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to Norman Perrin, the late New Testament critic here at the University of Chicago, the more we study the tradition with regard to the appearances, the firmer the rock begins to appear upon which they are based. This conclusion is virtually indisputable today. Now, at the same time that biblical scholarship has come to a new appreciation of the historical credibility of Paul's information, it must nonetheless be admitted that a lingering skepticism concerning the appearance traditions in the Gospels still persists. But this lingering skepticism seems to me to be entirely unjustified. It is based upon a presuppositional bias against the physicalism of the gospel appearance stories. But the traditions that underlie those appearance stories may be just as reliable as Paul's information. For in order for these stories in the Gospels to be, in their core, legendary, a considerable interval of time must be available for the gradual evolution and corruption of these traditions until the historical elements have been supplanted and replaced by unhistorical elements. And this factor is typically neglected in New Testament studies. The Greco-Roman historian A.M. Sherwin-White points this out in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament. Now, Professor Sherwin-White is not a theologian. He is a professional historian of the era roughly contemporaneous with the New Testament in Greek and Roman history. And according to Professor Sherwin-White, the sources for Roman history that he must work with are usually biased and usually remove 1 or 2 generations or even centuries from the events that they record. And yet, he says, classical historians reconstruct with confidence the course of Greco-Roman history. For example, the earliest accounts that we have of the life of Alexander the Great come from Arrian and Plutarch some 300 to 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians generally regard these as reliable accounts of the life of Alexander. The fabulous legends about Alexander the Great did not arise until centuries after these two authors wrote. Now, Professor Sherwin-White chastises New Testament critics for not realizing what invaluable sources they have in the 4 Gospels. He points out that the writings of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus furnish a test case which enable us to test the rate of legendary accumulation. And he says the tests show that even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. So when Professor Sherwin-White turns to the Gospels, he states that for these to be legends, the rate of legendary accumulation would have to be, and I quote, unbelievable. More generations are needed. You see, all New Testament scholars agree that the Gospels were written down and circulated within the first generation of the events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive. Indeed, a significant new movement within New Testament scholarship argues persuasively, I think, that several of the Gospels were written as early as the AD 50s. Now that places them just as early as Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And given their equal reliance upon prior tradition, they ought to be accorded the same degree of historical credibility that is accorded to Paul's information. In fact, I think it's very instructive to note that no apocryphal gospel appeared during the 1st century. The apocryphal gospels were forgeries under the apostles' names, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so forth. These did not arise until the generation of eyewitnesses had died off. They do not appear in the 1st century. They only begin to appear in the second half of the 2nd century and even later. And thus there was simply insufficient time available during that window of opportunity for significant accrual of legend so as to have corrupted the historical core of these stories and replaced historical memory with legendary fictions. And thus I find current skepticism with regard to the gospel appearance stories to be quite unjustified. And I think that the new appreciation of Paul's information needs to be accompanied with a reappreciation of the credibility of the gospel accounts as well. Secondly, the empty tomb. Once regarded as an offense to modern intelligence and even an embarrassment for the Christian faith, the empty tomb has come to take its place among the generally accepted facts about the historical Jesus. Let me review briefly just some of the evidence undergirding this conclusion. First of all, the historical reliability of the burial story supports the historicity of the empty tomb. You see, if the burial account of Jesus of Nazareth is fundamentally accurate, then that means that the burial site of Jesus was known to both Jew and Christian alike in Jerusalem. But in that case, it's a very short inference to the historicity of the empty tomb. For if Jesus had not risen from the dead, and and the site of his grave were known, then in the first place the disciples could never have believed in the resurrection of Jesus. For a first century Jew, the idea that a man might be raised from the dead while his body still lay in the tomb was simply a contradiction in terms. In the words of E. Ellis, a New Testament critic, it is very unlikely that the earliest Palestinian Christians could conceive of any distinction between resurrection and physical grave emptying resurrection. To them, a resurrection without an empty grave would have been about as meaningful as a square circle. But secondly, even if the disciples had believed in the resurrection of Jesus, it's doubtful they could have generated any following. So long as the body remained interred in the tomb, a Christian movement in Jerusalem, founded upon the belief in the resurrection of the dead man, would have been an impossible following. And in any case, thirdly, the Jewish authorities would have quickly exposed the whole affair. The quickest and shortest answer to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead," would have been to simply point to the occupied tomb in the hillside. And for these reasons, then, the accuracy of the burial story of Jesus provides strong support for the accuracy of the empty tomb account as well. Unfortunately, for those who wish to deny the empty tomb, however, the burial story is widely regarded as one of the most certain facts we have about the historical Jesus. According to John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the honorable burial of Jesus is one of the earliest and best attested facts about the historical Jesus. But if that is the case, then as I've explained, the inference that the tomb was found empty is not very far ahead. Secondly, Paul's testimony supports the fact of the empty tomb. There are two aspects of Paul's information that I read a moment ago that need to be mentioned. First of all, in the tradition cited by Paul, the expression, "and he was raised," following the expression, "he was buried," implies an empty tomb. A first century Jew couldn't have thought otherwise. As E.L. Bode observes in his study of the empty tomb, the notion of the occurrence of a spiritual resurrection while the body still lay in the tomb is an invention of modern theology. For the Jews, it was the remains of the person interred in the tomb that were raised. In fact, principally the bones of the dead were the object of the resurrection. And therefore, Jewish funerary practices were to carefully preserve the bones of their dead in ossuaries until the resurrection at the end of the world. There can be no doubt that both Paul and the tradition that he hands on presupposes the fact of the empty tomb. Secondly, the phrase that Paul uses, "and that he was raised on the third day," probably points to the discovery of the empty tomb. Now, very briefly summarized, the point is simply this. Why is it that the early Christians proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus on the third day? Why not on the 10th day? Or on the 7th day? Why on the third day? Well, the most probable answer is that they did so because this was the day on which the women followers of Jesus discovered that the tomb was empty. It was the third day after the crucifixion. And so naturally, the resurrection itself came to be dated on that day. And thus, in this very early Christian tradition cited by Paul, we have extremely early evidence for the historicity of the empty tomb of Jesus. Thirdly, the empty tomb story is part of the pre-market passion story and is therefore very old. That is to say, in Mark's account of the final week of Jesus' suffering and eventual crucifixion, Mark is relying upon a source that is even earlier. And since the Gospel of Mark is already the earliest of our four Gospels, that means that this source goes back even earlier still. Now, at this point, I think it might be helpful to simply read the account of the empty tomb as it's found in the pre-market, or rather, as it's found in the Gospel of Mark. and was part of the pre-market passion source. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, as part of the pre-market passion story, this account of the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb probably goes back to the very first few years of the Jerusalem fellowship of the Christian church. In fact, Rudolf Pesch, the German commentator, maintains that this is an incredibly early source, and he produces two lines of evidence for this conclusion. First of all, he points out that Paul's account of Jesus' Last Supper, given in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, is even more primitive, or rather, is not as primitive as the Markan account. That the Markan account of the Last Supper is even more primitive and earlier than the account given in 1 Corinthians 11. Now, since we've already seen that Paul's traditions are extremely old, that means that this pre-Markan passion source must be even older still. Secondly, he points out that the pre-Markan passion story never refers to the high priest by name. It's as if I were to simply say, the president is hosting a dinner tonight at the White House, and everybody would know whom I was referring to, namely the man currently in the office. Similarly, the pre-Markan passion story always simply refers to the high priest, as though he was still in office. Now, since Caiaphas held office from AD 18 to AD 37, that means that at the latest, this pre-Markan passion source must come from within just 7 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. Thus, this is an incredibly ancient source, and therefore a valuable historical source of information. Fourth, the story is very simple and lacks signs of legendary development. The empty tomb story, as I just read it, is uncolored by theological or apologetical motifs that you would expect to see characteristic of a later legendary account. Now, I think the best way to appreciate this fact is to simply compare Mark's account of the empty tomb with the account found in the so-called apocryphal Gospels, those later forged Gospels from the 2nd century and later. For example, in the Gospel of Peter, the tomb of Jesus is surrounded not only by a Roman guard, but also by all of the chief priests and Pharisees, and a huge crowd from the countryside who have come to watch the tomb. Suddenly, during the night, a voice rings out from heaven, and the stone over the door of the tomb rolls back by itself from the tomb. Then 2 men are seen descending out of heaven and entering into the tomb. Then 3 men are seen coming out of the tomb, 2 of the men upholding the third. The heads of the 2 men reach up to the clouds, but the head of the third man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now, these are how real legends look. They're colored and embellished by all sorts of theological motifs. By contrast, the Markan account is stark in its comparative simplicity. Number 5, the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. Now, in order to understand this point, you have to realize 2 facts about the role of women in 1st century Jewish Palestine. First of all, women occupied a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. This is evident, for example, in such rabbinic expressions as the following. Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women. Or again, blessed is he whose children are male, but woe to him whose children are female. Quite honestly, women were second-class citizens in first century Palestine. Secondly, the testimony of women was regarded as so worthless that they were not even allowed to serve as witnesses in a Jewish court of law. If a man were caught red-handed committing a crime by a group of women, he could not be convicted on the basis of their testimony, because the testimony of a woman was regarded as so unreliable that it would not even be admitted into court. Now, in light of these two facts, how remarkable must it seem that it is women who are the discoverers and chief witnesses to the fact of Jesus' empty tomb. Any later legendary account would certainly have made male disciples, like Peter and John, to have discovered the empty tomb. The fact that it is women rather than men who are the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb is best explained by the fact that they were the discoverers of the empty tomb, and the gospel writers faithfully record what for them was a rather awkward and embarrassing fact. Finally, number 6, the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the historicity of the empty tomb. In the 28th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, we find the earliest Jewish response to the disciples' proclamation that Jesus is risen from the dead. What were Jews saying in response to the Christian proclamation of Christ's resurrection? That these men are full of new wine? Or that his corpse still lies in the tomb there in the hillside? No. What the Jewish polemic was saying was that the disciples came by night and stole away his body. Now think about that for a second. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain away why the body was missing. And thus, from the very evidence of the enemies of Christianity itself, we have information verifying the historicity of the empty tomb, that the body was in fact missing. Now, I could go on, but I think perhaps enough has been said to indicate why the judgment of scholarship has reversed itself on the historicity of the empty tomb. According to Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian specialist in resurrection studies, by far, most exegetes hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. In fact, D.H. Van Dalen, a New Testament critic, has said that it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who do so, he says, reject it on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. But those assumptions may simply need to be changed in light of the historical facts. Finally, we can turn to that third body of evidence supporting the resurrection, the very origin of the Christian way itself. Even the most skeptical New Testament critics admit that the earliest disciples at least sincerely believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Indeed, they pinned nearly everything on it. Without belief in the resurrection of Jesus, Christianity could never have come into being. The crucifixion would have remained simply the final act in the tragic life of the prophet from Nazareth. And thus the origin of Christianity hinges upon the belief of these first disciples that Jesus had risen from the dead. But now the question inevitably arises, how do you explain the origin of that belief? As R.H. Fuller urges, even the most skeptical critic must posit some mysterious X to get the movement going. But the question is, what was that X? Well, if you deny that that X was in fact the resurrection of Jesus, then you've got to explain the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection as the product of either Christian influences or Jewish influences. Now, clearly it cannot be the result of Christian influences, for the simple reason that there wasn't any Christianity yet. Since belief in the resurrection of Jesus laid the very foundations of the Christian movement, it cannot be explained as a later creation of that movement. But can it be explained then from the side of Jewish influences? Well, in order to examine this question, we need to back up a moment to understand something about the nature of Jewish belief in resurrection of the dead. In the Old Testament, the Jewish belief in the resurrection of the dead is mentioned in three places: Ezekiel chapter 37, Isaiah 26:19, and Daniel 12:2. And during the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments, the belief in the resurrection of the dead flourished and became a widespread Jewish hope. In Jesus' own time, it was defended by the party of the Pharisees, but denied by the party of the Sadducees. And it's interesting that Jesus of Nazareth sided with the Pharisees in this respect. So, the idea of resurrection from the dead was in and of itself nothing new. This was commonplace in Jewish hope. But the Jewish hope of the resurrection from the dead differed in two fundamental respects from Jesus' resurrection. In Jewish thought, the resurrection of the dead always, number one, occurred after the end of the world, never within history. And two, it concerned all the people, never an isolated individual. In contradistinction to this, Jesus' resurrection was both within history and of an isolated individual. The greatly renowned New Testament scholar Joachim Jeremias summarizes this by saying, ancient Judaism did not know of an anticipated resurrection as an event of history. Nowhere does one find in the literature anything comparable to the resurrection of Jesus. Certainly, resuscitations of the dead were known, but these always concerned revivifications, the return to the earthly life. In no place in the late Judaic literature does it concern a resurrection to glory as an event of history. The disciples, therefore, given their traditional Jewish frame of mind, would at best have simply preserved their master's tomb as a shrine where his bones could reside until the resurrection at the end of history, when they and all the righteous dead of Israel could be reunited with him in the kingdom of God. But they would not have come up with the un-Jewish and outlandish idea that Jesus was already risen from the dead. And thus the mysterious X is still missing. Professor C.F.D. Moll of Cambridge University argues that we have here a belief which nothing in terms of previous historical influences can account for. He points out that we have here a situation in which a large number of people held tenaciously to this belief, which cannot be explained in terms of the Old Testament or the Pharisees, and that they held on to this belief until they were finally expelled from the synagogue. According to Professor Moll, the origin of this belief is most plausibly explained by the fact that Jesus really did rise from the dead. He writes, if the coming into existence of the Nazarenes, a phenomenon undeniably attested by the New Testament, rips a great hole in history, a hole the size and shape of the resurrection, what does the secular historian propose to stop it up with? The birth and rapid rise of the Christian church remain an unsolved enigma for any historian who refuses to take seriously the only explanation offered by the church itself. So these three great historical facts then, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus alive from the dead, the discovery of his empty tomb, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection, all seem to point to the resurrection of Jesus as their most plausible explanation. But, of course, there have been other explanations offered down through history of these facts. In the judgment of modern scholarship, however, none of these has succeeded in providing a plausible, naturalistic explanation of the facts of the case. And this can be seen, I think, by just a very rapid review of the principal counter-explanations that have been offered. First of all was the so-called conspiracy theory. This held that the disciples themselves stole Jesus' body and then lied about the resurrection appearances. This theory characterized, as we saw, the earliest Jewish polemic against the resurrection, and it was revived in the 18th century by deism. Today, however, the theory has been universally rejected and can be found only in either the sensationalist popular press or else in propaganda from behind the former Iron Curtain. To name only two considerations that are decisive against it. First of all, it is morally implausible to indict the disciples with such a crime. Whatever their imperfections, they were certainly earnest and sincere men and women, not imposters and hoaxers. No one who reads the New Testament unprejudicially can doubt that these people really believed the truth of the message that they proclaimed. Indeed, the shortfalling of the conspiracy theory is that it really cannot take seriously what a disaster the crucifixion was for these early believers. And that leads me to my second point, is that it's psychologically implausible to attribute to the disciples such a hoax. You see, at the time of the crucifixion, the disciples were confused, bewildered, doubting, disorganized, burdened with mourning, not at all psychologically equipped to carry out such a hoax of technicolored proportions. Judaism had no anticipation of a Messiah who would be executed by his enemies. When Messiah came, he was supposed to vanquish the enemies of Israel and restore the throne of David, not be humiliatingly executed by them. And thus the crucifixion put a question mark behind any faith that the disciples might have had that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. And thus the conspiracy theory really cannot take seriously what a crisis this event was for these disciples. Second theory is the apparent death theory. According to this theory, Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but he was taken down from the cross alive. He revived in the tomb and somehow escaped to convince the disciples that he was risen from the dead. Now, this apparent death theory was championed by late 18th and early 19th century German rationalist theologians, and sadly, it was even embraced by the father of modern theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher. Today, however, the theory has been entirely given up. Again, to mention just a couple of considerations against it. First of all, it would have been virtually medically impossible for Jesus of Nazareth to have survived the rigors of his torture and crucifixion, much less not to have died almost immediately of exposure and placed in the tomb without immediate medical attention. Secondly, the theory is explanatorily inadequate in any case, since a half-dead Jesus who crept out of the tomb desperately in need of bandaging and medical care would hardly have elicited in the disciples the belief in him as the conqueror of death and the risen Lord. And therefore, the theory is simply explanatorily inadequate. For these reasons alone, the apparent death theory is untenable. A third theory is the hallucination theory. According to this theory, the disciples projected hallucinations of Jesus risen from the dead, from which they then mistakenly inferred his resurrection. The hallucination theory was popular during the last part of the 19th century and carried over into the first half of the 20th century as well. Interestingly enough, it has recently been resurrected, if you will, by the German theologian Gerhard Ludemann, who is featured in the debate that was mentioned by Christina in her introduction. Again, however, I think there are good grounds for rejecting this hypothesis. First of all, it is psychologically implausible to posit such a chain of hallucinations. Hallucinations are usually associated with either mental illness or substance abuse. But in the disciples' case, the prior psychobiological preparation appears to have been wanting. Moreover, the frequency and the variety of the circumstances belie the hallucination theory. Jesus was not seen just once, but many times. Not just by one person, but by many persons. Not just by individuals, but by groups of people. Not just under one circumstance and in one locale, but in various locales and under varying circumstances. And the hallucination theory simply can't be stretched to accommodate this sort of diversity. Secondly, hallucinations would not in any case have led to the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. You see, as projections of one's own brain, hallucinations cannot contain anything that is not already in the mind. But we've already seen that Jesus' resurrection differed in two fundamental respects from the traditional Jewish belief in the resurrection. Given their traditional Jewish frame of thought, if the disciples were to hallucinate visions of Jesus, they would have projected visions of Jesus in heaven, in Abraham's bosom, glorified. This is where the Jews believed that the righteous dead went until they were to await the resurrection at the end of the world. But these hallucinations would therefore not have elicited belief in Jesus' resurrection, but rather in the assumption of Jesus into heaven, or the glorification of Jesus into heaven, a category of Jewish thinking which was explicitly distinct from the notion of resurrection from the dead. Finally, number three, the resurrection hypothesis cannot account for the full scope of the evidence. Hallucinations are offered as an explanation of the appearances of Christ, but they do nothing to explain away the empty tomb. In order to explain the empty tomb, you will have to conjoin to the hallucination hypothesis an independent hypothesis. And thus the theory has narrower explanatory scope than the resurrection hypothesis, which explains all of the evidence and therefore is explanatorily the better explanation. So none of the previous counter-explanations that have been offered has succeeded in plausibly explaining these three great facts as well as the resurrection itself. Now you might ask me at this point, well then, what do skeptical critics say to explain the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, the origin of the Christian faith? Well, the fact is, they don't say anything. Skeptical critics are self-confessedly left with no explanation at all. Contemporary scholarship recognizes no plausible, naturalistic explanation to the resurrection of Jesus. Those who refuse to accept the resurrection as the best explanation are simply left, self-admittedly, with no explanation at all. So, in conclusion then, these three great facts, the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, the origin of the Christian faith, all seem to point inevitably to the same marvelous conclusion, the resurrection of Jesus. The rational man can hardly be blamed if he concludes that on that first Easter morning, a divine miracle occurred. The cosmic orphan can come home. All right, well, at this time we'll open it up to your questions and any discussion that you would like to have. So who would like to raise a question or make a comment? Yes?
Are you a Christian and see online?
Okay, yes, I am a Christian.
And
And why am I a Christian? Well, I would say for two reasons. First of all, the Christian faith speaks to my existential need. It tells me why my life is meaningful and purposeful. It gives me a solution to the problem of evil, that is to say, my own fallenness and sin. It tells me how to find forgiveness and a gracious God. And it provides me a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. So that if you were to ask me why I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, I would not only point to the evidence, but I would also point to my relationship with the living Lord himself. Christ is a reality in my life that is immediately present to me. And so there is, on that one hand, the existential component to Christian faith. Excuse me. In 1965, on the evening of September 30th, it changed my life. And, so I wrote it down to carefully record that date. The other reason, however, that I would say for being a Christian is, in fact, that Christianity not only meets the needs of my heart, but it also meets the needs of my head. I believe that there are good reasons to believe that God exists, and good reasons to believe that He's revealed Himself in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, just as Jesus claimed. And therefore, I'm convinced that the Christian world in my view stands intellectually head and shoulders above any other worldview or ism that you could possibly adhere to. And so for those two reasons, I count myself enthusiastically a Christian theist. Yes?
The argument against the hallucination theory, like, if you apply it to Elvis, it
Yes.
seems like it wouldn't necessarily be a failing because Elvis has no prior, like nothing indicates that. Your argument was about that it's not in the preset mind of the disciples that this could happen. And yet, for a rock star to make appearances or rise to life again is not a preset notion, unless you cite Jesus as a preset notion.
Yes, and I certainly would. But students often ask about this, about Elvis sightings and so forth. And clearly, the belief in Elvis resurrection does come within a Western Christian worldview, which is totally predicated upon the belief in Jesus' resurrection. So it's not at all like the notion that these Jewish believers should suddenly come to believe sincerely that God had raised Jesus from the dead, in complete contradiction of Jewish beliefs or frame of thinking. But assuming that in fact these folks do not really see Elvis risen from the dead, and that would be, I think, a safe assumption. These sightings are one of either two things. They're either lies or they're hallucinations. I think probably most of them are just lies. They're just stories that people make up. But you see, neither one of those explanations can account for the appearances of Jesus. They're clearly not lies, because these people sincerely believed what they had seen and were willing to go to their deaths for the truth of it. And I dare say that there's no Elvis sighter who has yet been willing to go to a tortuous death for the belief in the resurrection of Elvis. Secondly, though, neither could they be hallucinations for precisely the reasons that I just explained. And therefore, I think the Elvis sighting analogy is one that I would like to appeal to, because I think it helps to make so clear the distinction between the belief in the resurrection of Jesus and the belief that Elvis is risen from the dead. The differences, I think, are very instructive. Yes?
Are there any Jewish sources that point to who Christ is and what he did here, or any Roman sources that would point to that as well?
There are. Jesus is mentioned in both Roman historical sources as well as in Jewish historical sources and later rabbinical writings. But these are later and secondary and don't really tell us anything new about Jesus that we don't already learn from the New Testament. So that while they go to confirm the portrait of Jesus found in the New Testament, they don't really tell us anything new. Let me state something, however, about what I suspect is the presupposition of that question that I would like to expose. Students very often have the attitude that these documents found in the New Testament really aren't credible historical documents, and therefore you can't really trust what they say. But if there were writings outside the New Testament, now those would be real historical evidence. And what they fail to appreciate is that originally there was no such thing called the New Testament. The New Testament came to exist later when the Catholic Church took the earliest and the best documents about Jesus of Nazareth and assembled them together under one cover. But when historians investigate the life of the historical Jesus, they don't treat these documents as an inspired, holy book. Rather, they treat them as what they originally were, just a bunch of documents in the Greek language coming down to us out of the first century. And they apply to them the ordinary canons of historiographical research. So that to ask for sources outside of the New Testament while ignoring the sources in the New Testament is to say, I'm going to ignore the earliest and the most primary documents in favor of the later secondary derivative documents. And that, as any historian would tell you, is simply perverse. By the very nature of the case, the earliest and most primary sources were collected into the volume that came to be called the New Testament. So, as I say, while these extra-biblical sources do confirm what's in the New Testament, they're really quite incidental to the quest of the historical Jesus that's being carried out today. The real question is, when you apply the ordinary canons of historiography to these manuscripts coming down out of the first century, telling this remarkable story about this man, Jesus of Nazareth, how credible are these documents? And as I've suggested, I think they are extremely credible, particularly with regard to these three facts concerning the fate of Jesus after his crucifixion. Yes?
First of all, thank you very much for the talk, but could you sort of explain the impetus behind each of the historical quests for Jesus, I guess? Would that be starting with Strauss? Yeah.
All right. The question was, what is the impetus behind the current quest of the historical Jesus? Well, that question could be answered in a number of ways, because the quest really began back in the late 18th century and has been a kind of off and on thing and has been revived recently. I think that originally the quest of the historical Jesus was brought about by the rise in historical consciousness that accompanied the Renaissance, so that now these documents could be treated as genuine documents of history. And so early writers such as Hugo Grotius, for example, and others began to offer the defense of the Christian faith by using these newly discovered methods of historiography. And so they began to apply to the Bible these historiographical tools in an attempt to defend the Christian view. Eventually, this grew into the study of New Testament criticism. Now, the reason I think that it is important today for many people to pursue is that if the Christian faith is not to degenerate into just mythology, there needs to be some sort of connection between the historical Jesus who actually lived and the figure that is worshipped by the Christian church today. Otherwise, the worship of Christ by the church is no better than the worship of Zeus or Thor or Krishna or whatever. But if there is a connection between the Christ worshipped by the church and the historical figure that actually lived, then this would serve to differentiate Christian belief from mere mythology. And so I think that that is a large part of the impetus behind discovering the historical Jesus and finding out how credible these documents really are. Yes, some other question. Over here?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the notion that this small band of Jewish believers wouldn't have given a chance to oppose all society and die for a lie. I was wondering if you could comment on the quality of the historical sources we have regarding the lives of the apostles and how they did that. I hear a lot of people saying that 11 out of 12 died.
Yeah, a lot of that's based on later sources that I think are not always reliable. But I think what we can say is that certainly all of these persons were willing to die. And some of them, at least, did die. And so clearly what that shows is that they weren't liars and hoaxers and conspirators. It doesn't necessarily show that what they proclaimed was true, but I think that it does completely evacuate the conspiracy theory of any credibility. And as I say, I don't know of any historian or New Testament scholar today who would defend the conspiracy theory. It's evident that these people sincerely believe the truth of the message they proclaim. So the real issue today is not the conspiracy theory. The real issue would be whether or not these accounts are, in their core, legendary or not. And that, I think, is the real issue that the New Testament historian needs to address today. Yes, in the cap.
Yes. First of all, I find your talk very helpful. Thank you. I have a question. It seems like one of your main points is that there was nothing in the tradition of the time when the disciples thinking that would have made them think that Jesus would rise from the dead, or this person would do
Now,
that.
can I just interrupt to say, I want to state it a little stronger than that. It's not just that there wasn't anything there, but quite the contrary. What was there was contradictory to it. It precluded it. Go ahead.
Just a couple notes that seem to contradict that. First,
Yes.
in the passage you quoted in 1 Corinthians 15, it says that he was raised according to the Scriptures.
Yes.
The Scriptures is the Old Testament.
Right.
Secondly, in Luke's, or it's in Matthew's account of it, the priests actually come to, is it Pilate? They come to Pilate and say, this guy says he's going to raise himself from the dead. I think the disciples are going to come and steal his body.
Yes.
And you put a guard there.
Right.
And he says he goes ahead and does that. And then obviously what they reference, Christ making all these references, I'm going to be raised up.
Right.
So those three things you respond to.
Okay. With respect to the phrase, in accordance with the Scriptures, has puzzled New Testament critics for decades. And the reason is precisely because of what I said, namely, there aren't any Old Testament Scriptures that predict the resurrection of Messiah or of anybody else. As I say, the resurrection is only mentioned in the Scriptures in those three places. And the one is Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones. The other two are talking about the resurrection at the end of the world. So scholars have, been cracking their brains to figure out what in the world Paul is talking about when he says he rose from the dead in accordance with the Scriptures, because there just aren't any Scriptures. And somebody like a John Dominic Crossan, for example, that I mentioned earlier, he says you can't explain away the resurrection of Jesus by saying that the earliest Christians ransacked the Old Testament and looked for prophecies or motifs about the resurrection and then manufactured the resurrection out of it, because he says there just aren't any materials like that in the Old Testament. So probably what they are referring to would be some sort of passage or verse that in retrospect could be interpreted in light of the resurrection, so that you could say the resurrection was in accordance with it. One of the possibilities would be Hosea 6:2, where it says something like, after he has afflicted us, after 2 days he will revive us, on the third day he will raise us up. And it's talking about God's restoration of the nation of Israel. Well, perhaps that could be applied, as to the resurrection of Jesus. Or more probably, I think, because this is the only passage that Jesus of Nazareth uses in the Gospels with respect to the resurrection, is the story of Jonah. That as Jonah was in the belly of the whale 3 days and 3 nights, Jesus said, so the Son of Man shall be in the belly of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. And so it could be that the Jonah story was read as a kind of symbolic resurrection of Jesus, an anticipation of it. But I think you see, as I say, nobody reading the Jonah story without a prior belief in Jesus' resurrection would read it in that way. So the according to the Scriptures probably refers to these passages that could be read in retrospect as being symbolic or interpreted in light of Jesus' resurrection. Now, with respect to the guarding of the tomb, there again, clearly the Jewish priests didn't believe that Jesus was actually going to rise from the dead. They thought that the disciples might steal the body, and so they wanted the tomb or the guard posted at the tomb. With respect to the predictions of Jesus that were supposed to have led them to do this, the difficulty here, you see, is that the New Testament scholars who are skeptical about the empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus don't believe that Jesus ever predicted his resurrection. They believe that those predictions were written back onto his lips by the later Christian church. So that if you accept that Jesus really did predict his resurrection, then you've got to also accept the facts of the empty tomb, the appearance, and so forth, because the evidence for the predictions is so scant in comparison to the evidence for the empty tomb and the appearances, that it would be impossible to say, well, I accept the weaker attested event, but I don't accept the stronger. And therefore, the skeptical critic, you see, really can't say what you just said, because if he accepts the resurrection predictions as historical, then he's got to accept the better attested events.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at www.veritas.org.